Hello. I must start with an apology. Many years ago at school, I did learn to speak German. And now, many years later, it has all gone. But I can remember, ich spreche kleiner Deutsch. So this will be in English. First of all, greetings from the National Archives of the UK to you, and it's a great privilege for me to be here. And thanks especially to Dr. Müller for talking me through the process of ending up here today. So, I was asked to speak about our user advisory group, but I felt I needed to give some background. So really this is a story of a journey, perhaps even an odyssey of discovery around working with users. But first some background. We are a government department, central government, and we are the official archive for UK government. And so we are the guardian of government information. We have more than 11 million records. Now, that's paper and parchment records. Digitally, we probably have even more now. And we claim to be the experts in information, creation, care, and use. We also have a role in that we are the lead body for the archive sector, particularly in England, but also for the UK. So we can represent into government the needs of archives and archivists. Okay, so in the beginning, the Citizens' Charter was launched in 1991. It was a government plan by the then Prime Minister John Major, who explained it like this. It will work for quality across the whole range of public services. It will give support to those who use services in seeking better standards. People who depend on public services all must know where they stand and what service they have a right to expect. For the UK, this was revolutionary. Before that, the tradition was government knows best, civil servants know best, and in the archives, archivists know best. This changed. Okay. And that was the logo, Citizens' Charter. And then in 1998, it was relaunched because there was a new government under Tony Blair, and of course they had to change things. So it was relaunched as Service First, the new charter programme. So this sets a context at a government level. It was mandated, but with all things that are mandated, some government departments do things quicker than others. So, here, the PRO, the Public Record Office, which is what we were called at the time, we were fortunate. In 1992, we had a new chief executive, a new keeper of public records, who was very keen and very dynamic and grasped this opportunity. It was a bit of a shock for us. So, we were part of a consortium in central government looking at quality of service standards. And in 1992, we ran our first user survey, I think, since 1970. So we actually went out and asked users very basic questions. They seem basic now, which established satisfaction. Oh, hang on. That's it, okay. Of about 89 to 95%. And that created a baseline. We also asked about extended opening hours. At that time, it was Monday to Friday, office hours. Did users want more hours, different hours? Okay. And we then issued our first charter statement in 1993. So, this first charter statement was really about how big is PRO and how much it does. So there was some data around how many documents and how many inquiries. It's interesting, the standards, but really they were targets, were around things like how quickly we will photocopy things and how quickly we will deliver documents to the reading room, how quickly we will answer letters. It seems quite strange now talking about letters because we hardly get any now. We just about had email then. Openness, transparency, this was again this big change. We will issue quarterly what we call a reader's bulletin, a newsletter, which was, of course, printed on paper. We will offer choice. Choice in government? It's new. Okay. We will run surveys. We will have forums, which I will come on to. and suggestion boxes. And there will be information about the courtesy, in that we will wear name badges, which back then was quite challenging for some of the staff. We would have a point at which the telephone was answered and how quickly we would answer the telephone. Again, this drove a change, because up until that point, the telephone was at the inquiry desk in the reading room. And you then have this thing, well, do I answer the person in front of me, or do I answer the phone? So we had to separate them, take the phone to the back office. We would also talk about value for money. Again, value for money, what does that mean in government? Government didn't do value for money, it just spent people's money. And then finally, putting things right. How to complain. You want to complain to the archives? No, don't do that. That came in. So we launched a programme called Readers First. It's our name for it. The important thing is it was a strategic target. Right from the very top of the organisation, there was a target that said, we would do this. It had that backing from the top. And we looked for quick wins, things that were easy to do, that would meet people's needs and requirements. And it was part of a 5-year objective to improve the range and quality of our services. Things like shorter queues. And I'll go on to talk about that a bit more in a minute. Longer hours. Surgeries. So the idea you could have a one-to-one with a specialist in your subject. Again, that was quite new. The comments procedure, changes to the inquiry service. And then, a year later, we delivered some of these things. And I mentioned their charter mark. I'll come on to charter mark in a moment. And we actively sought feedback. We actively went out and asked users what they thought of our services. That's quite scary. Completely alien concept to us and to government. The on-site surveys, we take them for granted now. Back then, it was new. In 1992-3, we had a first survey. At its peak, on-site, we were doing 4 surveys a year. We then encountered something called survey fatigue, where you keep asking too many times, people won't fill in the survey forms. So we scaled it back. So on-site, it's twice a year. But we now have 20-plus years of data, so we don't need to keep asking the same questions, because we have a body of data we can refer back to. We can now almost predict the answers. We ask a certain question, we can have a good guess at what the answer will be. So we don't need to survey so much. And we had Your Views Matter to Us, which is our name for comment forms. Not only did we collect them, we published them. So in our annual report in 1995, we first published a very tight selection of comments from our users. Not all of them good. We did publish some of the bad ones as well to show balance, but a lot of them were good. Since then, our on-site surveys, we have always achieved more than 90% satisfaction, and we are very proud of that. We survey online and have done for slightly less than on-site. That's much, much tougher. We're normally in the 60 to 70% satisfaction, sometimes as low as 50. Online satisfaction is much, much tougher than on-site. I think part of that is because when a user is on-site, they have a sense of the scale of the organisation and the challenges of finding information. Online, all they have is that screen and no real sense of, well, of course, it's just here, you have it, this is what you've asked for, rather than the 180 kilometres of records we have to go and look at. So, complaints, dear to my heart. We wrote a policy on how we would handle complaints, and we published that policy. And we still have that today. And it hasn't changed very much since. We've tweaked it, we've modified it, but broadly speaking, if you compared the original one in 94 with the current one, which we revised this year, they do look very similar. So the fundamentals, the basics haven't really changed about telling people what to expect, how quickly to expect it, and who will deal with it, and what to do if you are still dissatisfied. In about 1998-99, we appointed an independent complaints reviewer. So this was someone outside of the archives who was the next stage in the process. It gave us a stage between us and the statutory ombudsman, which is at the very top. We don't want to go near the ombudsman, really. And because we have this independent complaints person, you have to go through that process before you can go to the ombudsman. she's a very clever lady. She saw a niche market for government bodies that didn't have a statutory independent complaints reviewer, but bodies that wanted to have someone. She's still the only game in town after 20 years, so she makes a nice living out of it. It's good. She's very clever. We then went wider. This wasn't just about Public Record Office. It was about the archive sector. But, of course, the rest of the sector, most archives, much smaller, don't have the resources to do all of these surveys and write all these policies and do all the learning that we'd learned. So we shared it with them. There were like-minded people in the sector that wanted to get involved. So what we created was the Public Services Quality Group for Archives, PSQG, a national benchmarking forum. And one of the first things that they did was set up a national survey of visitors to archives in the UK. And the beauty of it is any archive could take part, but they didn't have to pay. It was all done for them. We used an independent body to create the surveys, to then take in the results and then publish them back. And what you also then got, of course, was comparison data. So you could see the data from other archives. So if you knew that you were about the same size as the archive in the next town, you could look at the data and say, well, we got that, they got that. Why did they get more? Why are they doing better? And then, of course, you have a conversation and say, well, what do you do that's different? This was really quite revolutionary and very powerful tool for archivists, because if you have responses to a survey that says your users are not happy with you, then you have some ammunition to go back to the town hall, people that are paying for the archive, and say, we need investment. Look, down the road, they are getting these wonderful results because they're spending more money on archives. Why can't we spend more money on archives? So it became leverage. About the same time, what also happened was a change in the way that local government was assessed by central government, and they brought in something that talked about value to the community. How do you calculate the value of an archive to a community? Very tough, but one thing you can do is use surveys and ask the right questions in surveys about how important the archive is to the user, but also questions about how much financial value does having an archive bring to a community or to a town. The survey helped with that, and the PSQG helped to collate that and then give the evidence back to the archivist to go back to the town hall and say, look, we do provide value for the community. Very important at the time. Things have changed since then, and I'm going to jump forwards to the Archive Service Accreditation Scheme. This is the current scheme in the UK, established in 2014, of which we are part of the governing body, but we don't run it ourselves. In fact, we are actually subjected to it, and I took the organisation through this about 3 years ago, and we're being reassessed at the moment. What accreditation does is it defines good practice and agreed standards for archive services, not just in terms of services to the user, but everything you'd expect an archive to do and have to do, and how well they do it. So it measures things like governance and financial stability. It measures accessioning procedures, standards of cataloguing, standards of buildings and premises, and also standards for users. And there's a long set of questions, and you have to answer them and put in information. And then you get a visit from the assessors, and they will spend a day, 2 days with you, grilling you on what you've written and showing them. It's a very good process. And the beauty of it is, if you achieve the accreditation, you get a visit from someone important, like my big boss, the Chief Executive of the National Archives, and he presents a certificate. Now, that's the nice bit. The important bit is you can go back to, again, the town hall or your funding body or whoever and say, look, we are good, this is worthwhile. The National Archives and the other bodies have recognised that we're providing good services. And we are seeing increasing buy-in to that. And the scheme is not just open to public archives, it's open to private archives, business archives, religious archives. Anyone that's running an archive in the UK can apply to be accredited. Very powerful tool. Yeah, and it's a really good thing. So, for a long time, this was my mantra in my job. Feedback drives change. You use what your users are telling you to inform the decisions you make about how you improve and change your services. Moving away from the archivists know best to the idea that actually sometimes users know best. Not always, but sometimes. We launched a lot of pilots and trials. Two of the most important ones, one was self-service photography and self-service copying. At the time, I was branded a heretic by my colleagues, particularly those that work in preservation and collection care, because I wanted to let users come in with their own camera and take pictures of archives. Oh boy. Oh boy. We had to trial it for 18 months. I had a member of staff who fortunately had a preservation background. She managed them and she's met every single participant in the trial. She watched them work. She took information about what camera they used, how they used it, how they handled the documents, before we could persuade the powers that be. But actually, the archives were not being damaged by people taking pictures of them. There was a perception that they would be damaged. In actual fact, we saw handling practices improve, because if you've got to take your hands off the document to take a photograph, you will use the foam and the weights to support it properly. In recent years, we've seen a shift, which is where the reading room almost looks like a filming bureau. And you have some users who are doing it too quickly. So there's a balance to be struck. And again, copying. So not only did we let people bring in their own cameras, we provided equipment that they could use. And at that time, the likes of Zoitzschel and others didn't provide equipment designed for public to use. So we just gave them what the staff used. We gave them a Zoitzschel scanner, crossed our fingers, did lots of supervision, and let them get on with it. It actually saved us money, which meant we could bring down the cost of the copies. Because before that, the users had to queue up, give a member of staff the document goes on the scanner, copying goes back. You're also reducing the handling of the document, because it's being handled by less people. It's being handled by the user. Does the copying, gives it back. The old process, it's handled by the user, it's handled by the person taking the order, it's handled by the person who's then making the copies, and so on and so on. Actually reduces the handling. We're now phasing out the self-service copying because we're just saying, bring your own device. So many people now, everyone has a mobile phone with a camera. They're now good enough that you can use that to take pictures of archives. 10 years ago that wasn't true, it is now. So we're phasing out providing the equipment. Document lockers. Even bigger claim of being a heretic. So, I'll give you the scenario. In our main reading room, we have 368 seats for readers to use. And at that time, 10, 15 years ago, quite often the reading room was nearly full. At the production counter, 4 staff if you were lucky. Now, I won't do the exact math, but it's about 1 member of staff every 90 people wanting to get to documents. So all you got was queues of people waiting to collect their documents. The people doing the issuing were moving about 3 metres between pigeonholes and the counter. And we knew from our surveys, because we'd asked people, what's most important to you when you're at the archive? Time. People's time in the archive is precious. It's a long journey out to queue, even from central London for some people. They want to make the most of their time. The biggest queue was the queue waiting for documents. So, we introduced self-service lockers. That's the finished article. The initial pilot, again, because it was so heretical, it ran for nearly 2 years. We took a standard set of metal lockers and we just took the back off. And we would put the document in from the back and the user would open the door and take it from the front. We used some of our trusted, regular users as guinea pigs for this and got their feedback. What we learnt from that is, yes, it's much, much quicker. We also learnt you can't use metal because the constant use wore out the coating, the steel was exposed, it started to rust. My collection care colleagues went, oh my God, there's rust. So, we specified these lockers. They were designed to museum display case standards, so the right kind of wood, it's solid wood, the right kind of varnish. Those doors are glass. We've now replaced those with coloured perspex. And you'll see that each one has a number and a letter on it. That corresponds to the seat number in the reading room. So there's 1 locker for every seat. Instantly, 40, 50, 60 people can all get to the documents at the same time instead of 4. So the queue evaporated overnight. From day one, the feedback was, this is fantastic. The staff, who were basically the 4 staff who were just ferrying that 3 metres, we turned into customer service staff to help people who are having problems in the reading room, not answering the research questions, just the logistics questions. I've got the wrong document, or I can't get it out of its box, or whatever. They were dealing with that. So we improved the customer service with no additional staff. We gave them a more fulfilling job. Instead of just shuttling 3 metres all day, they're there helping people. And also, they could supervise the self-service copying that was happening, because it was right in front of them. So we made them multi-purpose. And I'm going to go back. Okay. So we'd established a regular readers group way back in '94. And it was largely filled with the very regular users that were in the archives all the time. Most of them, they were the users who are making a living out of researching for other people. So they have quite a narrow perspective. And it was kind of by invitation. Basically, if you complained, my then director would say, come join our group, come once every 3 months, have lunch on us. And we'd have a conversation. No minutes were taken, nothing was written down, but it was still quite a closed forum, quite an elite group of users. In hindsight, of course, what you then get is that very narrow view rather than a broad view of who your users are and what they need. So, about the same time this was happening, in about 2003, 2004, we launched what I call User Forum Mark II, the second version of User Forum, open to everybody. You don't have to be invited, you don't have to sign up, you just turn up. And at that time, we gave them lunch. And that meant they came. They'd come and have a free lunch on us. And we would take minutes of the meetings and publish them. It takes quite a lot of resource to do that. Several members of my team, a lot of their time just managing this. But it was really useful, and we got a much broader cross-section of users coming and talking to us. And they would talk about anything and everything, from why haven't certain records come from government all the way through to why isn't there a table in the ladies' toilet, and everything in between. We also set up some specialist groups at this time for particular issues. We had a group that was looking at cataloguing data and diversity. There was an academic who was studying gay history and discovered that it was impossible to search archives of government archives, search the catalogues and find anything really about gay history, because civil servants creating records didn't use the word gay. So you won't find descriptions about gay. And he then uncovered this kind of hidden layer. And it wasn't just about gay people, about lots of communities that were represented in the archives, but you couldn't find them because of the language. So we set up a group with our cataloguing people and these academics and others to look at the issues of diversity and language, and also about the way that language has changed. Terms that were acceptable in the past are no longer acceptable, and what you do about that. Should you change the catalogue, or should you leave it as it is with a health warning? So a specialist group. That doesn't really fit in a broad session, so a specialist group for that. We had a disability group for disabled users come and give us their feedback. And then in 2007, we had a very large programme of refurbishment, and we moved the remaining central London facility out to Kew. And we set up a specialist advisory group for that with the beginnings of representative users. For me, the big change with that group is we had an external chair. She was someone that we worked with, but she was not a member of staff, and she chaired that group to give it that sense of independence. So we were reporting into a group that we didn't manage. It was very useful. It was also useful to help show to the users at large that we took them seriously. It did work very well. So, all is wonderful. All is great. Go past my picture. One more bit of great. Okay, so Chartermark, which I mentioned at the beginning, was replaced because these things get replaced by Customer Service Excellence. This is the current standard. This is a cross-government standard which can be used by any government department or agency, and indeed the private sector can use it. it's very similar to it. It sets up very generic measures of quality. What's important, it doesn't tell you how to do it. So if you go and say, should we do this, they'll say, that's not our question. That's for you to do. You have to demonstrate that it meets the requirement or the need. And it's very broad. And it was replaced by Customer Service Excellence, which was similar but more modern. And it's a rolling programme. So within Customer Service Excellence, there's about 65 substandards in about 5 categories. You can have 2 choices. You can do every 3 years and do the lot, or you can do a third of it every year on what they call a rolling programme, which is what we do. We've probably had the standard for as long as nearly any government department. We first got charter mark in 1998, and there's a photograph of some of my colleagues with Tony Blair getting the first certificate. And we've now got Customer Service Excellence. And they have a system where you can go everything from not compliant to partially compliant to Compliance Plus. Compliance Plus is best practice, an exemplar. We're very proud to say that we have more Compliance Pluses than nearly any other government organisation. Very proud of that. Our keeper, Chief Executive, he's very proud of that. No pressure. No pressure. Luckily, as of this year, it's not my problem. It's someone else's. I've changed roles. But it's still very important. And it's also good for the organisation because it keeps it focused. And the reason I say that is this. In 2009, we had a wake-up call. So, the TNA, by now we're with the National Archives, TNA. No modesty, not the National Archives of the UK, we're just TNA. A bit like the Americans are just NARA. The TNA 2010 project was launched in 2009 by our then keeper, who had a lot of critics, but she could see ahead and she could see the financial turmoil that was about to come. And so she instituted a cost-saving programme before the rest of government did. Basically, do it to yourself before it's done to you. Risky, there was no guarantee it would work. She sought to take out 10% of the costs from the organisation. This included closing to the public on a Monday, charging for the car park, reducing the number of staff, including the number of staff that were in the reading rooms, which, of course, are the staff that the users know. The user forums still happened. Oh boy, I felt like I needed to wear a protective vest when I was in those meetings, and you think that people were throwing vegetables at us. It was that close. It was really, really stormy. But the biggest impact was from a particular group, which is the academic sector. So they didn't really engage in user forum. There were other channels. And 2 of our directors went with one of our non-execs, who was a well-respected academic, to a meeting of the... I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think it was the Institute of Historical Research, so representing the academics, historians in the UK. And they were lynched, practically. It was that bad. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. The director, who was one of the people who was lynched, is now our chief executive. He still remembers it. It kind of went down in history. But what it demonstrated was that actually we had misunderstood the needs of that sector and how we'd worked with them. And it turned out, when you look in hindsight, that we had blown hot and cold with them. We'd been very uneven in our engagement with the academic sector. Not so much on an individual level, but an organisational level. So our participation in multidisciplinary projects, our participation in funding schemes, that kind of thing, we'd blown hot and cold. And one of the proposals from the savings was to abolish the department that was the one that actually dealt with academics the most. It was really bad. And it went all the way to our minister. Now that means, in one sense, in government sense, if it goes to the minister, it means we as civil servants have failed. And the ramifications were significant from that community. The other challenge we had was, I mentioned we were going to reduce our headcount. It meant that some staff were going to be made redundant, which meant that we couldn't tell anybody, because the law in the UK says that if you're planning to make people redundant, you must talk to them and you must talk to the unions first before you do anything else, which meant we couldn't go public with any of this, or we had no mechanism to do it. So when we did finally go public, and some of it was still up for discussion, the feedback was, this is a done deal. We can't influence it because you've had to make that decision. Because we'd had to make the offer to the people being redundant and the unions first. So all of a sudden it's like, hang on, how do we deal with this? Our users are saying they want to be involved, but we're talking about stuff that we can't make public. So what we did is we had a review of user engagement. Someone from within the organisation, but totally separate from my team and everyone related to it, did a thorough review. They spoke to people inside TNA, they spoke to users that came to the user forums or on the other groups, they spoke to people who didn't come. And they did a thorough review and they made some recommendations. One of the most important recommendations is the user advisory group. It was established to deal with exactly that problem of how can you talk to users about things that you can't actually go public with. So it was about being more strategic with them and being able to engage at an earlier stage. The important thing about this group is they represent identifiable communities within our broader users. And I'll talk about those in a minute. We fully administer it, so we do 4 minutes of meetings and they get lunch and they come once a quarter. Lunch is important. They have to sign a confidentiality agreement. So there'll be certain things we discuss that can't go public yet, but we want their input. So we say, we can talk about this, but don't tell anybody. But at least we get some interaction. Some things, of course, can be public straight away. But we can share with them confidential things. That's really powerful. It's very important. And also, I think, makes them feel empowered as well, that they're privy to things early. And we can get the feedback on those things before we make the final decision. It's a structured way of getting feedback and having a dialogue. So the meetings don't get stormy and frosty because everyone understands the etiquette of the group. It's a closed group. But we recruit to it as if we were recruiting staff. So we make open advertisements for people to join the group. Each delegate serves for 4 years, so we cycle through, so we don't get people staying there too long. And we then advertise at the end of each year for replacements for the few that are going to be leaving. In terms of the communities they represent, we have academics, we have the professional researchers, we have the personal interest or hobby researchers, we have someone representing the local archives and external archives, we have people representing the diverse communities, so representing ethnicity or disability. We also... Let me think. Yeah, so. But we're also open to suggestion about ways of changing the communities. So a couple of years ago, we had the applications come in, and we will say we're looking for this group, this group, this group, but we welcome any application. And we had an application that came in from someone who wasn't academic, but they were what they call an early career academic. So they weren't an established person. They were learning. They got their degree, they got their PhD, they were in that next stage. And they came to us and said, you don't really meet our needs. So we said, OK, we'll change it slightly. And we invited him to join to represent that community. And we've done that several times, so it's not fixed and becomes stale. We have an online user representative. That's quite challenging because by their very nature, they're not at Q, they're online. That's always been a tough one, to find someone that can get to the meetings and represent this online user community. The other thing that's good about it is it provides a voice through representation for those people that can't or won't use other channels. Those people who don't want to make a formal complaint, don't want to fill in a survey form, don't want to talk to us, for whatever reason, they can go and talk to someone else. What we've introduced this year, at the suggestion of the users, the representatives of the users, is the on-site personal interest representatives actually have a nameplate. And when they're in and researching, it's on their desk, and at the entrance is a sign-up saying, the personal interest representative is in today if you want to go and speak to them. And that was their idea. Brilliant. And it works. Really good. The other thing that had to change, because of the resource I needed to put into this one, is we then moved to what we call Mark III, the third version of User Forum. So to balance out the additional resource I had to put into user advisory group, we had to scale back user forum. So it now only meets quarterly rather than monthly. We reduce the administration. We don't do full minutes of the meetings. It's bullet points as much as possible. Trying to move people to that was quite tough because some of the people in the room really want us to write it verbatim. I just can't do that. But it is open to anybody. We publish the notes online. We make the dates available online. We don't give them lunch. We do give them tea and biscuits, but we don't give them lunch. Part of that is also because of austerity. We were told as a government department to cut down on how much we were spending on providing people with lunch and tea and biscuits. We don't have it internally at all. So if I have a meeting with colleagues from government, we had to buy our own. So there was pressure. But we made a case to say that we needed to maintain something because the evidence showed if you stop feeding them, they stop coming. So we needed to carry on doing that. The other thing is the delegates at the user advisory group come and report back to the Open User Forum. So at the User Forum meeting, it's not just me or one of my colleagues as the face of TNA telling them stuff and answering questions. The actual delegates, their representatives come and stand up and talk about what was discussed at the last meeting of UAG and take questions. That's quite challenging for some of them because they maybe aren't used to doing that. But I think some of them actually found it a really, really powerful experience doing that. And it's interesting that the people in the room are quite nice to them in a way that sometimes they're not nice to me. I'm normally the bearer of bad tidings. I'm the one giving them the bad news that something's got to change, which they may not like. Because just because you engage with your users doesn't mean you can always give them what they want. There are sometimes other imperatives. And that's happening now. We are having to shift some of our resources away from the on-site service to other things, which means that they will perceive a downgraded service. In actual fact, it will still be a very good service. You will still get your documents in less than an hour from ordering them. You will still be able to advance order more documents, in fact, than you could before. But they will see it as downgrading. But the challenge we've got is we identified that digital is our biggest challenge, and yet only 5% of our staff resource was actually working on digital. Now, that doesn't quite add up. So we've had to say, well, we need to shift some resource. It's been a big thing for the staff as well, but for the users on site don't see that. They don't see the challenges that we have dealing with government in how we solve those digital problems about bringing in digital records. So we're going to have some stormy waters. The interesting thing is, when everything's going swimmingly, very few people come to use a forum. But I know there are one or two things I could drop a bomb and they'll be there. So if and when we have to charge for the car park, because we ended up not doing it because of the reaction we had, if we have to do that, and we probably will because they're building a new housing development next door, and we think the residents will want to park in our car park, we may have to introduce charging. And if we do that, I know that they will come and they will be throwing the vegetables at me again. Okay, so summary for you. User engagement is worthwhile, most definitely. I get criticism even internally. Well, why do we do it? Because quite often when people come, they don't have a good experience as staff because sometimes they're giving bad news. I'm kind of inoculated against it now. I'm used to it. I'm quite used to going in and having the things thrown at me. It is worthwhile because you learn things and you can do new things. The idea that you bring your own camera into the reading room and take pictures wasn't our idea. That came from a suggestion on a Your Views form from a member of the public who said, well, I've got a digital camera, why can't I bring it in? That came from there. The survey that said time is of the essence, we turned that into cutting down queues. It came from users. If we hadn't asked those questions, if we hadn't given those channels for people to tell us, we wouldn't have learnt those things and we wouldn't be what we are today. So it is worthwhile. It needs commitment from the top. If your chief executive or your board or your governing body doesn't buy into it, it won't happen. Because there will always be people that don't want to do it because it's inconvenient listening to the users. So you need that commitment from the top. And right from the beginning, we had that commitment from the top. We had the new chief executive saying we would do this. Every other chief executive followed on. We've had the strategic targets at top level that get reported to government that support it. And you need to maintain that. You need that support, because if you have the support from the top, they will make sure it happens. That's important. It does need some resource. Okay, if you don't put a little bit of investment into it, it doesn't work. So, my team as it was before, I have 2 members of staff that deal with complaints and feedback. That's what they do all day, every day. We use a CRM system to log it all and track it all. We respond to everything that comes in. Sometimes we have very complicated complaints to manage. And increasingly, it's not about the on-site services. Increasingly, it's really complicated things about why records haven't come from government, or the way that a freedom of information request was handled. Or indeed, because we're also publishers of legislation, things to do with legislation publishing. The easy ones have gone. It's now the difficult complaints. I have 2 staff. That's all they do. I have a member of staff who part-time effectively manages the user advisory group and the user forum. Doesn't need to do it full-time, thankfully. But it's still about a third of her time overall, which she can't spend on other things. So it does need that resource. And that's ongoing. That's not just every now and then. That's all the time. It does need resource. But the other thing is it needs to be sustained. And that really, I think, was the lesson from 2009 and the academic saga, that we didn't sustain the relationships, which is why in 2009 they got really upset. So you need to sustain it. You're in it for the long haul. You can't just walk up to the users, say, tell us what you want, and then walk away. Because, for one thing, they want to know what you're going to do afterwards. But the second thing, what they ask for now isn't the same thing they will want to ask for in a year's time, or 2 years' time, or 10 years' time. You can't rest on your laurels. So it needs to be sustained. And it needs to be developed. So those things the world doesn't stay the same, it changes. And of course, the more you do for the users, you just kind of increase their expectation. They become more demanding. You have to manage that, but you have to keep on listening to them. You have to keep on talking to them. Thank you very much.